camera goes down first, before any person. It descends on a cable through a hole cut in nearly 40 meters of ice, and for a long time the screen back on the surface shows nothing but the drift of pale particles falling upward past the lens, the way snow falls up when you sink beneath it. The water is not black. That is the first thing the diver would tell you later, when he could still be persuaded to speak of it at all. The water is a deep and living blue-green, lit from above by a smeared coin of daylight 38 meters overhead, and the floodlight on the camera housing throws a cone of hard white ahead of it into that blue. For 4 minutes, there is only water. Then the light finds the first trunk. It stands upright. That is the detail that stops you, the detail that stopped all of them. Not a log rolled flat on the seabed, not a mat of broken timber the way you find drowned wood in any cold lake. A trunk, vertical, rooted, rising out of the dark sediment and reaching up toward a surface it cannot reach because a ceiling of ice sits between it and the sky. The bark is there. You can see the bark. It is blackened, almost lacquered, the color of something burned and then frozen before the burning could finish. And it holds the grain, the long vertical lines of the grain, and where the camera drifts closer, the operator can count the ridges of it. Branches come off the trunk at the angles branches take when a tree grew slowly toward light. Some are broken, most are not. They reach out into the water and hold their shape, and on the smaller limbs there is a darker fringe, a softness at the edges that the men on the surface argued about for the rest of that night, and some of them for the rest of their lives. Then the light widens, and there is not one trunk. There is a wall of them. They stand in ranks going back into the dark past the reach of the floodlight, dozens of them, and the ones nearest the camera are the size of full-grown trees, a meter or more across at the base, and they are spaced the way trees space themselves in a living forest, not the way debris piles when a current dumps it. The floor between them is smooth. The trunks throw shadows, and the shadows move as the camera turns, sweeping across the standing timber like searchlights across a crowd, and behind every trunk the light catches, there is another, and the forest simply continues into water that the equipment could not illuminate. A survey technician watching the monitor on the ice that night wrote a single line in the margin of the log, and I have read a transcription of it, and the line says only, "They are all still standing." He underlined the word all. This was a forest under the Antarctic ice shelf, upright, intact, standing in dark seawater beneath 40 meters of permanent ice, hundreds of kilometers from any coast where a tree has grown in the memory of our species, in a place where the surface temperature that week was recorded at -31 degrees, and where nothing green has stood in the open air for a span of time that geologists measure not in centuries, but in the tens of millions of years. And it was not fossilized in the way we understand the word. Petrified forests exist. We have all seen the photographs of them, the trees turned to colored stone in the deserts of Arizona, the cell walls replaced atom by atom with silica until the wood is rock that happens to be shaped like wood. That is not what the camera found. The camera found wood. Blackened, waterlogged, cold-soaked wood, with bark that had not turned to stone and branches that flexed, very slightly, in the pressure wash of the thrusters when the operator held station too close. Stone does not flex. I need to tell you how they came to be looking there at all, because the discovery was an accident, and accidents are harder to fake than triumphs. This was a glaciological survey. The team was not hunting for anything. They were a small unit attached to a larger seasonal program, and their assignment was ordinary to the point of tedium: to drill a series of access holes through the floating shelf and lower instruments into the water column beneath it to measure temperature, salinity, and the rate at which the underside of the ice was melting into the sea. It is slow, cold, bureaucratic work. You melt a hole with a hot water drill for the better part of a day, you sync your sensors, you read your numbers, you move a kilometer, and you do it again. The camera was almost an afterthought, a downward-looking unit meant to check whether the borehole was clear and whether the instruments were fouling on anything as they descended. Nobody expected the camera to see anything but water and, if they were unlucky, the underside of the ice. The hole they cut that morning was, by the coordinates logged, not a special place. It was one grid square among hundreds. The drill broke through into open water a little after 11. They lowered the sensor string, took their first readings, and the readings were wrong. The water was warmer at depth than the model said it should be, warm enough that one of them said aloud that the instrument must be faulty. So they sent the camera down to look at the sensor to see if it had iced up on the way down. The camera passed the sensor, kept going on its cable, and someone on the surface, watching the monitor with the flat attention of a person expecting nothing, leaned forward and asked the man beside him to stop the winch. They stopped the winch, and the wall of trees hung there in the light, motionless, waiting, in water that had no right to be that warm, beneath ice that had no right to have anything alive or once alive standing upright beneath it, at a depth and a latitude where the entire framework of what we believe about that continent says there should be nothing but cold sediment and the slow dark. They held the camera on that first trunk for a long time before anyone spoke, and when the survey lead finally did speak, over the open channel, the recording of his voice, because there is a recording, and we will come to how it survived, says one thing, quietly, almost to himself. He says, "Bring it up slowly. Don't touch anything." They brought it up slowly. But before the camera cleared the trunks, something happened that is not in the official log, and I only know of it because two separate people, decades apart, described the same 7 seconds in almost identical words. As the winch drew the camera upward, the field of view swept across the standing forest, and in the lower corner of the frame, for the duration of one slow pan, a shape that was not a tree moved between two of the trunks. Not the drift of a loosened branch, not silt disturbed by the cable, a vertical shape, darker than the wood, that passed behind one trunk and did not reappear on the other side. The man watching the monitor did not say anything at the time. He told his wife about it 11 years later, and she wrote it down in a letter I have held in my hands, and the phrase she used, his phrase, was, "It stepped out of the light." I want to be careful here, because this is the exact point where a story like this either earns your trust or loses it, and I would rather lose you honestly than keep you with a lie. There is no frame that clearly shows a figure. I have looked at the surviving stills at magnifications that turn every grain of the emulsion into a boulder, and what is in that lower corner is a smear, a density, a place where the light does not resolve into anything you could name in a court of law. A skeptic would say it is motion blur on a swinging camera. A skeptic would be within his rights. But the men on the ice did not see a still frame. They saw motion on a live monitor in real time, and motion is the one thing a photograph can never fully give back to you. Whatever they saw, it was enough that the survey lead, a man his colleagues describe as unflappable to the point of coldness, changed in the space of a single afternoon. Because here is what the forest did to the people who found it, and it did not do it with teeth. It did it slowly, from the inside, the way a splinter you cannot see works its way deeper. The diver went down first. His name appears in the equipment manifest as the safety diver for the sensor recovery, and he was, by every account, an ordinary, competent, unromantic professional who had logged hundreds of dives under ice and regarded the whole enterprise as plumbing. He entered the water to free the camera cable, which had fouled on something during the ascent. He was down for 19 minutes. When he came up, he would not immediately speak, and when he did speak, days later, to a colleague who thought to write it down, the thing he could not get past was not the size of the trees, and not the darkness, and not the impossible warmth of the water. It was the leaves. He said there were leaves still attached to the lower branches, and that when his glove brushed one, it did not crumble the way a fossil crumbles, and it did not float apart the way something rotted for 10,000 years floats apart. He said it bent. He said it was soft. He said, and this is the line the colleague underlined twice in his own handwriting, that it felt like a leaf you would pick off a hedge in June. Think about what that sentence is actually claiming, because it is not a small thing. Organic material at that latitude, at that supposed age, should be mineralized, replaced molecule by molecule with stone, or it should be gone. A leaf that still bends is a leaf that, on some level the diver's hand understood before his mind could argue with it, had not finished dying. He never dived that site again. He never dived professionally again at all, and while I cannot draw a clean line from one to the other, I can tell you that he left the field within the year, and that the one time a researcher tracked him down to ask, he said only that some things are logged for a reason and hung up the phone. The proof they carried back up the borehole was, at first, handled exactly as proof should be. There were film canisters, 4 of them, indexed by the camera operator with a discipline that survives in the margins of a notebook I have seen photographs of. Each canister was numbered, dated, cross-referenced to the grid square and the timestamp on the winch log. This is not the behavior of men inventing a legend. This is the behavior of a survey crew doing what surveys do, treating the impossible as just another data point to be filed correctly. And for a short while, the file existed as they made it. Then the canisters were sent up the chain for developing and cataloguing as everything was, and somewhere between the ice and the institution, the record began, very quietly, to change its shape. The originals were logged under the survey's geophysical series, the same series as the temperature profiles and the ice thickness charts. When they surfaced again in the paperwork months later, they had been moved. They were no longer geophysical data. They had been reclassified into a miscellaneous holding, the kind of category an archive uses for material it does not know what to do with and would prefer not to think about, and the cross-reference to the grid square had been dropped in the transfer. Dropped. Not contradicted, not corrected, not explained. Simply left out of the new entry, so that the images still existed but no longer pointed to a place on the Earth. You can lose a thing forever without destroying a single frame of it. You only have to cut the thread that ties the picture to the map, and it becomes a photograph of nowhere, an anomaly, a curiosity, something that could have been taken anywhere or nowhere, easily set aside and easily forgotten. I have come to think this is how most of what we have lost was actually lost, not burned, just unfiled. The survey lead is the one who haunts me. In the field reports written before that morning, his voice is everywhere, precise, opinionated, generous with detail. After that morning, on the subject of the forest, there is a silence so complete it has its own weight. He filed the mandatory notes and nothing more. He declined, politely, every opportunity to elaborate. Colleagues who raised it with him informally described the same maneuver each time, a slight turning away, a change of subject, a man closing a door with his shoulder while still smiling at you. One of them, near the end of his own life, said he believed the lead was not hiding something he had decided to conceal. He was hiding something he had decided not to believe, and the not believing cost him more effort every year. He had said it himself on that first recording, before he understood what he was saying. Don't touch anything. As if the trees were not a discovery to be claimed, but a room you had walked into by mistake, and the safest thing was to back out without waking whatever slept in it. And then there was the second expedition, mounted quietly some seasons later by people who had seen the images and refused to let them go. They had the coordinates from the winch log, the original ones, before the reclassifications severed them. They went back to that grid square with better cameras and a specific intention. They drilled. They lowered the string. They found cold water at the depth the models predicted, sediment where sediment belonged, and no trees, no forest, no warm layer. Nothing but the ordinary, correct, unremarkable dark that the whole framework of the continent insists should be there. They moved a kilometre and drilled again and again, working outward in a grid of their own, and the forest was not in any of the holes. The site, as a place you could return to, had ceased to exist. And that is the detail that turns the whole thing over in my hands, like a stone that is warm on one side, because a fossil stand does not move. A fossil stand is exactly the one thing in this story that should have stayed put and waited for them. It did not wait, or it was never a fossil at all. Or something between those two sentences that I do not have the words for, and neither, I think, did the men who stopped the winch and held the light on that first trunk and asked each other, on an open channel, to bring it up slowly and not to touch anything. So let me lay out the ordinary explanation plainly, because it deserves to be laid out plainly, and because the people who hold it are not fools. They are, in fact, the careful ones. Their account goes like this. Antarctica was not always ice. 90 million years ago, in the long, warm middle of the Cretaceous, the land that is now buried under 2 miles of the shelf was temperate rainforest, a canopy of southern beech and conifer and fern that grew in the low, dim light of a polar summer that never fully set. We know this. It is not fringe. Cores pulled off the Amundsen Sea in 2017 brought up a mat of fossilized roots so intact that researchers could read the individual cells, pollen and spores from a forest that stood at 82 degrees south when the poles were green. So a preserved stand of that forest, driven down and sealed under later ice, exposed in a pocket of meltwater by the slow grinding travel of the shelf, is not a miracle. It is close to expected. The trunks would be black because they were mineralized, carbon and iron replacing wood cell by cell over the age of the world. They would stand upright because they were never felled, only drowned in place and buried where they grew. And the reason the second expedition found nothing is the most ordinary fact in all of glaciology. The ice moves. The shelf that carried that pocket of trees past the drill in a single season is the same shelf that carried it on, tens of meters a year, until the coordinates in the winch log pointed at open water above a floor that had simply walked away. That is the skeptic's forest, and I want you to feel how strong it is, because I feel it. It explains the trunks. It explains the movement. It explains the silence of a survey lead who realized he had stumbled onto a fossil bed of extraordinary value and, in the culture of the program he answered to, had no channel to report it that would not cost him the sight to a better-funded team. I find this persuasive. For a long stretch of the weeks I spent inside this material, I believed it, and I was relieved to believe it, because it let me set the folder down and sleep. And then the frame refuses. There is one photograph. You know the one, because it is the one I opened with, the wall of upright trunks at the edge of the floodlight, branches reaching up into water that has no current to lift them. Look at it the way I have learned to look at it. A mineralized fossil is stone. Stone does not have leaves. And in the lower left of that frame, low on the nearest trunk where the light falls off into green-black, there is foliage. Not the ghost of foliage, not a smear the mind assembles into a leaf. There are leaves, lobed and whole and hanging, and one of them is bent back on itself in the way a living leaf bends, and a stone leaf never can, because stone has no fold in it. The diver who went out on the tether wrote the word himself in a margin the reclassification did not reach. Soft. He touched one, and it was soft. 90 million years, and it was soft. That is the detail no core, no pollen count, no map of Cretaceous latitude will cover, because a leaf that is soft is a leaf that is alive, and a forest that is alive under 2 miles of ice, in water that the whole framework of the continent insists must be freezing dark, is not a fossil that the shelf carried away. It is something that was down there doing what living things do, and that had a reason of its own to no longer be in the grid square when men came back with better cameras and a specific intention. I have gone back to that image more times than is good for me. And each time I go past the trunks, past the reaching branches, past the soft leaf in the corner, to the thing I did not let myself see at first, which is the dark beyond the light. A floodlight in black water makes a wall. You see to the edge of the beam, and then you see nothing, and the nothing is not empty, it is unlit, which is a different and worse kind of thing. In that unlit water at the top right of the last frame the survey team exposed, there is a shape. It is only a change in the darkness, a place where the black is organized differently than the black around it. Vertical, where the other trunks are vertical but wider, and set apart from the stand, standing in the water between the trees and the camera at a distance the flash could not reach. I have shown it to people who know how light behaves underwater, and they have said, carefully, that it could be backscatter, a column of suspended sediment, a trick of the strobe. It could be. I cannot prove it is not, but I keep returning to the order of the recording, to the fact that this is the last frame. There were more film canisters logged than there are frames anyone has seen. The roll stops here. The survey lead stopped the winch, held the light on the first trunk, and asked the crew on an open channel to bring it up slowly and not to touch anything. And then, somewhere in the minutes after this exposure, the camera came up and the forest was left where it stood, and the coordinates were quietly cut loose from the images. And a man spent the rest of his working life learning not to believe what he had seen so that he would not have to say what he thought was standing in the water just past the trees, watching the light watch it. So I will leave you where the shutter left them. The floodlight is on. The trunks are black and upright and reaching, and they have no business surviving down there, and they are surviving. In the corner, a single leaf hangs soft against 100 million years of ice. And out past the beam, in the water the light could not open, something is organized differently than the dark around it, and the roll ends before anyone brought the light any closer. They asked each other not to touch anything. They brought it up slowly. They cut the coordinates loose and filed the canisters and moved a kilometer at a time through empty holes trying to find the place again, and the place was gone, the way a thing is gone when it has decided, and not the way a fossil is gone when the ice has simply walked. I do not know what it was. I have told you everything the record allows and a little more than it wants me to. And the question I cannot set down, the one that has stood at the edge of my own light since the first hour I opened the folder, is the same question the man on that open channel was already trying not to ask out loud. Not what were the trees. The trees, in the end, we can almost explain. The question is, what was standing among them, in the dark, just beyond the floodlight, when the shutter closed, and whether it is still standing there now, under the ice, in the water, waiting for someone to bring the light back down.